Ken, I want to speak with you a little bit about the Gospels, and more specifically the Gospel of John. As we know, our Bible is divided up into two major sections. Some of us call the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures, the New Testament. And in there, the major parts of it are the letters of Paul, and then we have these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called the Synoptics and which are very similar. And then we have this fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, which seems to be quite different. I'd like to talk a little bit at the very beginning about the way people's reaction to these Gospels. If I ask some people sometime, well, what's your favorite Gospel? I mean, some people will say, well, I don't know. They're all blend in my mind. They're all together, and they're not distinctive. And I'm sure that's true. But there's some people who will say, yeah, my favorite Gospel is such and such. People, for example, I think, who are into justice matters, we might say, well, Luke's Gospel is a lot about justice. I like that. Or Matthew's got a distinctive picture of Jesus, and I like that. Or sometimes members of religious orders evidently like Matthew's Gospel. There's a lot about the church and the community. It's often called the Gospel of the church. So I think historically you can see the same thing. It's commonly been said that Matthew's Gospel was very popular in the early centuries as the church was straightening itself out and trying to make sense out of its life and get the community going and make itself into a church and knowing how to live within the empire and so on. So that Matthew's Gospel, very big on the church, would be popular at that time. So it's interesting analysis, as we call that reception theory. How are these Gospels received by groups and by individuals?
Yeah, that's true. And you bring out some good examples. In the Vatican II liturgy of the Church before Vatican II, I looked this up one time, there's just no question that we gave far more attention to Matthew's Gospel than any other. Because of its quality of teaching. It was able to present Jesus' teaching in much greater detail than the others. We downplayed Mark by comparison a great deal. But today, Mark's picture of Jesus, which is not prettied up, which is very stark, very no-holds-barred, is very appealing to people because of the get back to nature, be an honest, unvarnished approach to Jesus that appeals.
I think also probably because of the emotion that Jesus shows.
Exactly.
And the vivid detail. And the quick cuts from one scene to another.
Exactly.
Someone has said that this is the Gospel for the postmodern age, that Luke would be the Gospel for the modern age because it's continuous. It's a clear narrative. Things hold together. There's a pattern. Someone has called it the tale of two cities, so that it centers on Jerusalem and Jesus going to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem it heads out, it spreads out and goes all the way to Rome, the second city. And so Luke's is just a wonderful, rational, clear statement. It appeals to those of us who grew up in a book culture as opposed to a television culture, I think. It appeals to those of us who are sort of logically inclined or see patterns in things. And so a very different feel, but Mark's Gospel, then very different. There's interruptions. It doesn't end right. It's not complete. It's not a nice, rounded picture it gives us, rough, and as you said. So Luke's Gospel would appeal to the modern world, the world where we thought progress was the order of the day, that the world's getting better and better through rational means, and science will create a better world. And it's a nice, neat world. Some of us live in the suburbs probably feel that way yet. It's a neat world. It's that other chaotic world out there. But now as we begin, that world gets challenged by events, and we can't handle terrorists, and we don't know what to do about certain situations around the world. Even though we got weapons and we're powerful, we can't seem to do anything to stop the evils in the world. So we begin to question that, and in that setting, then maybe Mark becomes more popular. It's a postmodern gospel in that way.
We could move from there to slide into maybe what we'd like to talk about today, which would be John's Gospel.
John's Gospel. Now, who does John appeal to? That would be, I'll just throw one out, and that is, he's often appealed to the mystics, the people who are into participation with God, who see things as a sort of melding together, the vine and the branches kind of image, which is crucial in John's Gospel.
That's very true, and I think one of the big reasons for that is that the picture of Jesus that appears in John's Gospel is a transparent Jesus. that the divinity is always shining through, that Jesus does not, in John's Gospel, Jesus does not talk like the Jesus in the other three Gospels. It's a different kind of language. Every parable he tells, he doesn't really tell his allegories in John's Gospel, but all his discourses, all his statements, all have to do with himself, who he is, and what kind of claims, faith claims that makes on the believer.
And that plays off against the synoptics, where Jesus doesn't talk about himself, but talks about the kingdom. The reign of God is here.
That's right.
And I think historically we usually think that the synoptics are more accurate on this point.
Yes.
Do we not? I mean, that he really did preach the kingdom. I mean, if you were walking around in the year 2930 and heard his sermons, his discourses, probably you would hear a lot more about the kingdom and not so much about himself. So in this case, John, we think the synoptics are more accurate than John, where so much emphasis put on I am this, I am the greater than Abraham, and all the I am passages. But there's other places where we think John is more accurate than the synoptics.
That's right, and you raise a good point there. When the question comes, if the primary value we want to know in approaching the Gospels is which Gospel is historically more accurate, we're going to ask a different set of questions. As we have talked on other occasions, I like to say that John's Gospel is the Gospel that shows more clearly than any of the others what Gospels really are and what they're not. Because for none of the four, not just John, but also Matthew, Mark, and Luke, none of the Gospels are trying to be histories or biographies and try to portray things in a historically accurate fashion. Jesus said this on this day, and then the next day he did this, and then the third day he did some other things. They didn't have the information necessary to do that, even if they had wanted to do so.
Because they were not eyewitnesses.
That's correct. No. Rather, what they were trying to do is to give an interpretation of Jesus. This is the way to understand the Jesus that has been preached to us. And what they would do then is that they felt free to adapt the teachings of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, in such a way that their communities would understand correctly what these sayings really meant. And they thought they were doing a service, and we agree, of course, they're doing a service in doing that. What inspiration means is that God stands behind those interpretations and says, yes, if you understand my son this way, then this way, meaning this, the way Matthew does it, the way Mark does it, the way Luke presents him, and the way John presents him, all four together. If you understand my son that way, then you've understood him correctly.
I like what you said about interpretation, Ken, because
yes.
I think it brings it right up to the present moment. That is, just as the evangelists had to interpret Jesus for their culture, their precise setting, and for themselves, incidentally, we have to do the same today.
Yes.
We are always involved in a process of interpretation. We have these texts, these Gospels. They are classic texts, and that means that they have a surplus of meaning. They say more than even the evangelists could have ever known. And we are able to read them today. We bring our own experience to them, our own questioning, our own presuppositions, and we hear them in a way different from any other age.
That's correct.
So the reception theory, again, is that it's ongoing, that it changes with cultures and histories, and that's the reason we get different things out of it. And so people could read John's Gospel today and see things that other people never saw, just like the liberation theologians have reread Luke and seen things that people just glossed over for years about Jesus the liberator of captives. So we bring our own questioning to it and make our own interpretation in that sense, although always in a community of faith.
Exactly.
It's not a private interpretation notion, but it's part of being a church community.
And when we look at John's Gospel from that perspective, coming back to the reception idea, I think that the John's Gospel appeals particularly to, shall we say, fundamentalists or to people who feel beleaguered and besieged and attacked, because John's Gospel is clearly a gospel that is forged in controversy and pain. And it's a gospel that, as one lady who I respect very much mentioned to me, that John was her favorite gospel because it's the gospel of love. And it's true, the Gospel of John has amazing, wonderful statements, just beautiful statements, starting with John 3:16. I'm not even starting with that, but I mean John 3:16 is the one that everybody thinks about first of all. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. But it also has very strong statements of the opposite kind, where the decision has to be made. You have to either choose for Jesus or against Jesus. In John's Gospel, there's no gray area. There's no sitting on the fence. It's either light or darkness. It's truth or falsehood. It's a gospel that has strong dichotomies. Some would say it's even in philosophical terms, it's a dualistic gospel.
Mm-hmm.
that what happens in the ministry of Jesus is just the latest incident of this eternal warfare that goes on between right and wrong, truth and falsehood,
between light
the
and
real
darkness,
and the apparent, between...
you get that light and darkness thing right away in the beginning, of the
that's
gospel.
right.
I was talking to someone about this whole thing, and they said they weren't so thrilled with the Jesus of John. He seemed grumpy to them.
Yes.
That he was sort of jumping on people, where we get in Luke a very compassionate Jesus, and never wanting to offend. He's almost like the gentleman in a way.
Yes.
And in John's gospel, evidently, this woman was picking up on this, but Jesus sounded pretty tough, and I think her word was grumpy, or a synonym. I don't remember exactly what the word was. That was the impression that I had.
She's correct in that perception.
Yeah.
Yes, there's
you get a different feel for Jesus. On the other hand, you used a word earlier that's very telling, and that is transparent, that the divinity shines through Jesus. The scene in the garden would be an example. The agony in the garden in the synoptics, Jesus is suffering, and Father, why can't this chalice pass from me? I don't want to do this. And they come and apprehend him. He's sort of a victim almost of fate. Not fate in the gospel, but he's a victim of the whole process of history.
That's right.
But in John's gospel, he's in command. They come to get him, and he says one word, and they fall over.
That's right.
He's the Lord right in the midst of being arrested. He's in total charge.
In chapter 10, he's got the statement, which is really true, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down of myself.
Right, and that's played out then through the whole Passion account, the way John presents him. Yeah. He's in charge of his life. He's freely handing it over.
And it goes all the way through. You said that well. Jesus is not a passive figure in John's gospel at all. The Passion narrative in John is, as someone has said, is kind of the procession of a king, regally going through the coronation process, where he ends up being crowned with thorns, put the purple on, and then enthroned in the final scene, and then finally exalted under the banner. This is the King of the Jews. His kingship is recognized in that fashion, but all the way through, there's no doubts, no hesitancies. The human side is just gives way to what's really going on here is that Jesus.
You made a point I didn't want to move beyond too quickly of the appeal. We were saying, well, who do the Gospels appeal to? You know, and we were trying to say Mark is maybe a gospel for the postmodern age and the people whose lives are not smooth, and people who are in divorces and disruption in their lives, and it's, they have the child that leaves home, or the family troubles, or the death of a loved one. All the disruptions might appeal to Mark, might appeal to people suffering from disruptions. And Luke appealing to the charismatics, the ones into the spirit, or the social justice activists, or the people who like to find God in the history, in the flow of history, in the ordinary events. And John, then we said, would appeal to mystics, people who are into participation, who are like the vine and the branches. But then you went back and you said it appealed to the fundamentalists and people who are troubled in spirit, who are having maybe doubts and are looking for clearer answers. And I take it you're saying that because it's a clear warfare between light and darkness in John's gospel, and the choices are clear and so on. Is that, am I picking that up right?
I would apply it a little different way. The people who don't have any doubts, who are very clear on who Jesus is, and who feel themselves attacked then by everyone else whose faith is not sufficient. Okay. Part of this comes...
who feel themselves under attack. That was the key point you made. Yeah,
exactly.
Who are beleaguered, you said, in some way. That's good. I'm glad you clarified that.
And so they stand strong for their interpretation as though it's just the truth without anything, as though their interpretation is the truth and not an interpretation. It simply is the truth. If you don't accept my way of looking at it, then you're wrong. There's no other question about it. You just, as a Catholic, I'm often struck in my work with fundamentalists when they say that Catholics are not Christian. And the way they can say that is because we don't interpret Christianity the way they do. Therefore, we don't even get the title from them anymore. Part of this is clarified by at least as Ray Brown has traced the history of the community that produced this gospel.
Yeah, he's got a good book out on that.
Yes,
right?
he does. Yes, and the subtitle is the Loves and Hates of a New Testament Church, which I think the community of the beloved disciple, the loves and hates.
The community of the beloved disciple by Raymond Brown, probably the finest Catholic biblical scholar in the United States, commonly thought of. Well-known figure. So he studied John's Gospel in particular, hasn't he?
That's right. He's got 2 real thick volumes.
Well, now let's, and he tries to trace the development of this community. So let's hear a little more about that.
He thinks that what happened, and I'm going to simplify this. It's very long process, but simplifies it very little.
We're going 2 volumes here in 2 minutes, Ken. Yeah.
He draws attention to the importance of the Samaritans as constituent members of the Johannine community. The Acts point out that Peter and John went to the Samaritan community. John's Gospel itself has an important chapter 4 that talks about how the Samaritans came to believe in Jesus. The Samaritans were not expecting a Messiah who was the son of David, a kingly figure. They were expecting a Taliel, a Messiah who was like a new Moses, who would reveal the will of the Father. In John's Gospel, we find the image of Jesus not so much as one who does things as the one who reveals the truth. Yeah. And the important idea is accepting the truth. Salvation comes in accepting the teachings of Jesus. When John's Gospel, another thing it's known for is its language. John frequently uses the term Jews to refer to the church, to refer to the authorities in Judaism rather than the people at large.
And they are the enemies.
And they are the enemies.
That's a bad word
in
John's
When he's talking about the Jewish people at large, he calls them the Israelites. But I think the Catholics at least would have a perception of that, because we often speak of the church. The church teaches this or that, and we really mean by the church's authorities say this or that, but we use the term for the whole to designate the individual. That's very understandable coming out of a Samaritan point of view, that they would say the Jews did this or the Jews did that in a kind of a negative sense, because that was not their heritage. On the one hand, the one front that the Johannine community waged war against was the Jewish side, that they were excommunicated from the community for making a god out of Jesus, is the way the Jewish and Orthodox Jew would look upon their claims for Jesus. On the other hand, they were also fighting a battle against the Gentile community. At first, they had made great strides.
Are you saying that the community would have been predominantly Samaritans, or just?
I would say that no, I would not hazard. Maybe Ray Brown does. I don't remember anymore what proportion of the community was Samaritans, but a significant number of.
We should say Samaritans. We should say a word about Samaritan, a mixed blood sort of group.
That's right.
That goes back to the exile period, and
these were the pagans who were brought in to replace the native Israelites when they were sent into exile in the Far East. These were pagans that were brought in. When the Jews returned from the Babylonian exile in 537, these now people who lived in the land who were mixed blood, they wanted to take part in rebuilding the temple and so forth, and the people who came back refused to allow them to do that they were the true Israel and not these people of the land. There began an enmity there that just got worse and worse over the period of time. Right. And so the world is the second. The Gentiles are the second battlefront for the Jewish Johannine community, and that's why the battlefront is always against the Jews and the world, as it's referred to there. But what's even more interesting, as Ray Brown traces it, is that the Johannine community went into schism even from the larger church. The way the Petrine church, the larger churches are represented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, it took them longer to come to an appreciation of the divinity of Jesus than the Johannine church. The Johannine church, therefore, broke away from the larger church. So that and this is the respect in which I think they're like fundamentalists, that they broke off from the larger community. The Paraclete was insufficient. That enlightened each person to tell them the truth. They didn't need church leaders to tell them that. But of course, with that principle, that the Spirit, the Paraclete, enlightens each person, that is a recipe for further fracturing, and that's exactly what happened. We find represented in the 3 letters of John, later stages in the community, where in fact the majority of the community,
cathedral schools and
Gnosticism, and finally the remnant of the Johannine community came back to the larger church, which by this time had acquired a sufficiently high Christology, a belief in Jesus as truly divine, and where they could be comfortable again. But as a consequence, we find that even though the Johannine community brought the gospel with them, speaking about reception theory, the larger church was a little leery about John's gospel at the beginning because of its use by the heretics, the Gnostics. We find, without exception, all the early commentaries on the Gospel of John are commentaries by Gnostics. It takes a while before...
Again, the word Gnostic suggests people who had a distinctive worldview in which there was dualistic, there was light against darkness. And,
salvation comes through knowledge.
Through a deeper awareness, bad attitudes towards the world, the physical, material world, poor attitudes towards sexuality, negative attitudes, should say, towards towards that. It's a very spiritualistic kind
That's
of
right.
thing. It's
And you can see there's many things in John's Gospel that would be very congenial to that perspective, and so that's why they kind of... Another thing that brings out is that maybe your reader...
Have we finished the story so we have this clear? Let's do some dating and some geography here, just to make sure. So you've painted a picture here of a distinctive Christian community. You've called it the Johannine community. It's the community that eventually produces the Gospel of John and the letters of John.
Correct.
And this community at least has Samaritan members
That's
in it.
correct.
And they're fighting on two fronts. They're fighting against the Jewish community that thinks they're heretics because they're making Jesus into the God. And they're against the Gentiles, the world, the people who've adopted, who I guess would keep just the cultural values and wouldn't understand the deeper significance of what Jesus' moral transformation meant.
The Johannine community demanded a break with the world, and so they would not allow them to buy and sell and so forth. Well, this was too much for most.
Much more radical kind of group.
That's right.
And okay, now let's make sure we got the history of that. I mean, what years are we talking about here, and what geography?
Okay, between the 50s and the 80s, and using Ray Brown's dating, would be the formation of the community with its double membership of Jews and Samaritans, and an opening to the Gentiles. Well, the gospel is dated in the 90s, and this is the point where the break occurs with the larger church. One of the things that readers will notice,
You're saying the break occurs in the 90s?
In the 90s, when the gospel is written.
Yeah.
That's the stage at which the gospel is written. And one of the things that you'll notice is that always the beloved disciple, or virtually always, I better say, because I can't think of any exceptions right now, but I think virtually always the beloved disciple appears in connection with Peter, and always to Peter's detriment.
Right.
It's always
they run to the tomb
together, but the Peter goes in first, but the beloved disciple is the one who understands. On the boat, Jesus is on the shore of the sea. Peter sees them, but the beloved disciple is the one who recognizes it's the Lord. Right. The Last Supper.
So this is representing this conflict between the Johannine community and the larger church, which is, I guess, already sees Peter as the center point of it, and is now being centered in Rome gradually.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
So then, during the hundreds, that would be when the community further fractured, and that's the late 90s or early hundreds would be the period in which the letters are written, and then something like between 100 and 200 in that century, the Johannine community comes back to the larger church, bringing the gospel with it, and also,
but it fractures because you also have Gnostic elements that just go away from any real sense of incarnation.
That's right, exactly.
Well, Ken, that's fascinating. I mean, it's very helpful in trying to locate John's Gospel and to get a better feel for it. It raises a lot of different questions about, again, this reception thing. Who's going to be appealed to here and who gets something out of it? And the beleaguered person you've pointed out might well get something out of it. Those with more mystical tendencies. We might just stay with that for a minute. And
I'd like to.
And you want to say more about the vine and branches imagery or the various ways? There's a whole participation theology in John. For example, when Satan comes, he doesn't just tempt Judas as an outsider, but he takes him over. There's a sense about humanity being taken over by the great powers, either for good or for evil. Satan enters into his heart, and he's sort of taken over that way, the same way that the real follower is taken over by Jesus. And I think there's a difference here where Luke would give us a lot of ethical demands or a moral dimension. I mean, and we'd see a clear idea where you should not do this, and you're converted by, in terms of behavior. In John's Gospel, you're converted by awareness.
Yes.
The great problem is people understand at too superficial a level. Nicodemus says, what, am I supposed to go back in my mother's womb again? And the woman says, you're going to give living waters, you don't have a bucket. So we've got all this superficial understanding which John keeps portraying, but what Jesus is after is a deeper message, and it does border on that Gnostic thing you said, like there's a deeper illumination here if you really get it, and that's the only way to really participate in this life of Jesus.
I definitely would like to follow up on that because since we talked about the fundamentalist side, now we can talk about the mystic side. One of the things I think that does appeal to the mystic side is that John's Gospel, Kaiser calls it the maverick gospel, because it approaches things a different way. What the Johannine community found very instructive for them and very valuable for them was meditating on these scenes from the life of Jesus and seeing deeper and deeper meanings in the ordinary events of life, such that it eventually became their conviction that nothing that Jesus did was trivial. It was all revelatory of what was going on. And so when we look at John's Gospel, instead of finding these multiple miracles like we have in the Synoptics in Mark, for example, we find, as usually counted, just 7, of which only one is in common. It's the multiplication of loaves is the only
So we've
miracle
got 6
that we find.
distinctive miracles in John's Gospel.
Correct. That's correct. And what they're chosen for is precisely how they reveal something deeper about who Jesus was, what was going on in Jesus. And the Synoptics, they're called dunamis, works of power. It comes from the idea of the kingdom again, that God, Jesus as God's emissary, his legate, defeating the powers of evil. In John's Gospel, they're called signs, because that's the idea. They reveal who Jesus is. Each one's connected with a discourse where Jesus talks then about that.
People pick up on that. The first of his signs.
That's right.
He worked at Cana of
That's
Galilee.
right.
The word is signs here for what is happening.
And when you study them, they are amazingly significant. Little tiny details. The symbolism in John's Gospel is strong. And the example that I always use is from the Last Supper. When Judas betrays Jesus, John adds a sentence, and it was night. Well, by clock time, it was night, but you can just be sure that's not why he mentions it. It's because of that whole symbolic thing that he was leaving the light of the world, rejecting the light. It was night, and it would have been day.
Moving back into the realm of darkness.
That's right. That's right.
Taken over by Satan.
And I think that's another reason why he's very appealing to mystics or people who look more deeply on more common things of life and see meanings there that maybe other people miss.
It's commonly said the gospel appeals to theologians, but I mean,
Yeah.
we could probably question that, whether theologians really do see the
Deeper than other
deeper
people.
things or not, and whether the common people who are not average parishioner who has not had that education might well see the deeper meanings of the gospel. Ken, it's fascinating. I love to talk to you about these things. You have a passion for the scriptures and a real care and reverence for them. You hear them in the light of the whole tradition and in the context of the church, which I am much appreciative of. And we've looked at John's Gospel and seen that its distinctive kind of characteristics, a deepening awareness, get away from the superficial, get down into understanding who Christ is. And who he comes to be is clearly the Son of God, the highest exaltation of Jesus. And he acts in a powerful way, and God keeps shining through him. Jesus' characteristic statement is, I am. The Father and I are one. They're together. You know me and you know the Father. And that really helps us, I think, appreciate the genius of the Johannine community and the one who put it all together that we call the beloved disciple.